Hello and welcome to UnHerd News. I'm Freddie Sayers. We've all heard stories of cancellations and enforced political viewpoints on university campuses, and obviously we can't cover them all. But once in a while, a story emerges that seems to reveal the inner workings of how today's thought police actually operate. Ilya Shapiro should have been a senior lecturer and executive director of Georgetown's Law Centre for the Constitution. But he's not. His story all comes down to a single tweet. I want to go through it with him step by step to try to understand how power and censorship is operating in 2022. He joins us from Virginia. Hi, Dr. Shapiro.
Hello, good to be with you.
So let's just kind of go through in order what happened to you. It's late January 2022. You've got this great job offer from Georgetown. You're planning to take up your post later that year. And at the same time, President Joe Biden is in the midst of selecting a new Supreme Court justice, but he's doing it in a way that's a little bit different from previous selections because he's determined the race and gender of the successful candidate in advance. That's the background, right?
That's exactly right. January 26th, news of Justice Breyer's retirement leaks. I think it's kind of to force him to actually take the plunge. I was on a plane to Austin, Texas when that broke. I landed and my phone was blowing up because I'm a Supreme Court commentator. And so I did some media hits, put out some statements, then had some meetings, the purpose of my trip to Austin, and went to a dinner to celebrate a friend's new job. Came back to my hotel room and late at night did something that I recommend nobody does, which is doom scroll through my phone to look at the latest news on Twitter, and got more and more upset about the president limiting his pool of candidates for the Supreme Court by race and gender. He said, of course, that it would be a black woman, reiterating his campaign pledge. And so I kind of snarkily and what I quickly admitted the next day when I realized things were blowing up was inartful. I tweeted the following: objectively best pick for Biden is Sri Srinivasan. He's the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, meaning the federal appellate court in the capital, the second most important court in the country, who is solid prog, meaning progressive, and V smart, very smart. You can see already the restrictions of Twitter already affecting how obviously one communicates on it. Even his identity politics benefit of being first Asian, parentheses, Indian American. He's an immigrant actually from India. But alas, doesn't fit into the latest intersectionality hierarchy, so we'll get lesser black woman. It's those three words that would get me into trouble that have prompted this whole 4.5 month long news cycle and imbroglio now. And then I conclude the tweet, thank heaven for small favors. Now, what I meant there, obviously, was that, I thought, running through my head of all possible candidates, that Judge Srinivasan, who had been on the shortlist for Barack Obama for the nomination that ultimately went to Merrick Garland, was the best pick for a Democratic president, which meant by basic order of logic that everybody else on the entire planet was a worse pick or less qualified. And given that Biden had restricted his search to black women, that meant that we would end up with a less qualified than Srinivasan black woman. Now, that was twisted. I went to bed. I tweeted that. I went to bed again. Not a best practice. Woke up and everything had blown up. My ideological political enemies were trying to get me fired, sicking the online mob on me. And so I quickly took down the tweet, said, didn't mean to offend. I worded this poorly. Sorry.
Why did you take it down? And what were you apologizing for? I'm sure you're used to being kind of questioned from the other direction, but ostensibly, to a lot of people, what you wrote seems perfectly reasonable.
The underlying point certainly was 76% of Americans agreed with the underlying point, according to a poll by that right-wing organization, ABC News. That's sarcasm. ABC is one of the central networks in America. But I was trying to keep my job and not be a distraction from the Center for the Constitution that I was poised to lead. I hadn't yet taken the job. 5 days later, February 1st was when I was supposed to start the job. I was still at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank where I'd been for nearly 15 years. And I took it down because I'm in the communication business. Written, oral, media, Supreme Court briefs, articles of various kinds, and that was poor communication.
Why? Why was it poor communication? Was it proved to be poor communication because of the reaction it generated? So it's a kind of proven after the fact, or do you think it was poorly worded? What actually are you apologizing for about that tweet?
No, I think it was poorly worded in the sense that it gave something to those with bad faith to grab onto and start smearing me and start smearing my center and all the rest of it. And I didn't want to get into that kind of debate over, all of that. I'll just take it down. I'll rephrase the standard commentary that I've long made, against racial preferences, against treating people differently based on immutable characteristics, all of that. I didn't want that tweet, which was not, if I had been, in a different format, if I was writing a blog post or an op-ed, I would have said, I think Judge Srinivasan is the best pick, but he won't be considered because of the way that identity politics plays and the way that Joe Biden restricted his candidates. And so, everybody in the universe will get a less qualified person. And since Biden has restricted in that way, we'll get a less qualified black woman than Judge Srinivasan. I would have, put it in some sort of terms like that.
I want to progress down the story, I promise. We're not going to be stuck on this moment forever, but I do think it's really interesting because actually you notice that this a lot, that it's almost, the point has been conceded by people in your position as you were then, that if a furore eventuates after you've put out a statement, then by definition there was something wrong with your statement because it was bad communications and you gave red meat to the enemy or whatever. And so there's this now tradition of people saying, I don't want to be a distraction and therefore I will apologize and retract. I wonder, in retrospect, since you're not even connected to the center anymore, is there an argument for saying you shouldn't have retracted it and you should have just stuck to your guns and said, look, it's quite clear what I mean. If people in bad faith want to misinterpret it, that's not my business.
Based on my understanding of what was going on behind the scenes at Georgetown, I think if I hadn't retracted it and sent out a short statement that was blasted out to the faculty, that I probably would have been fired right then. And my goal was to keep my job. Notice I didn't withdraw. I didn't, bend the knee to, woke ideology or anything. I just said, look, this was badly worded and sorry for that. And so what happened is that after those 4 days of hell, essentially, the day it broke was one of the worst days of my life. And it lasted a few days. And then the dean announced that I would indeed be onboarded on February 1st, but immediately placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation into this tweet and whether it violated university policies on anti-harassment and anti-discrimination. And then, so 4 days of hell were then followed by 4 months of purgatory while they so-called investigated the tweet. Really bizarre because, as lawyers, you apply law to facts to figure something out. The facts were indisputed. It was this short tweet. The law, university policies are indisputed, pretty short, pretty clear. And yet it took them 4 months. And at the end of this is last week now on Thursday, the dean cleared me or reinstated me. Why? Because of the free speech policy or because what I did wasn't actually harassment? No. Because somebody looked at a calendar and realized that I had not been an employee when I tweeted and so was not subject to these policies. But implying strongly, both in the statement the dean issued and the report I later got from the diversity bureaucrats, that a future such statement would create a hostile educational environment. And clearly at that point, I'd be disciplined.
So who actually conducted the internal investigation?
It were the offices of Human Resources and Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, the IDEAA, kind of an Orwellian moniker.
What is that? Who constitutes such an office? Since when do universities have that body? And since when does that body have power to remove faculty? Who are these people? It's
basically HR on steroids, leavened with woke ideology and identity politics. It's these things started cropping up, within the last decade. Before then, it was just, people, officers in HR who looked at discrimination and harassment claims. But now it's this whole structure, this whole ideological, metastasis that has been growing and accelerating. The growth of these places is just, Georgetown has I don't know how many dozens of diversicrats in this office and related office. There's Title IX, which it refers to a part of the U.S. Code about gender equality, and so there are Title IX officers separately from this IDAA. Georgetown is really, it turns out, a leader on the bleeding edge of having these inquisitors that are looking to make sure that nobody is saying something or doing something that's politically correct in the context of an identity politics valence.
So have you even been into campus since this event?
During my paid leave, while I was suspended, I was not allowed on campus because that would make people feel unsafe.
So you've actually never been to Georgetown as a employee?
That's correct. I was given special dispensation to attend a 1-week seminar in the second last week of my suspension after the students had left campus after graduation. There was a seminar that was part of my center that I was allowed to attend in my personal capacity. So I was still on leave, but I was there on campus. But since I was reinstated on Thursday, no, I did not go.
So it would be kind of interesting to know who the Office for Diversity, Equity and Affirmative Action actually is. Do you think they have a physical office in the building? How many people are on this body? Are they drawn from faculty? Are they, if I want to apply to join this office, what degree do I need to get? What's the career path look like?
They're hiring. They're constantly hiring because, the demand for racism outstrips the supply, so they have to hire these bureaucrats to manufacture outrage. I don't know how many of them there are. 2 of them interviewed me. So during this process, early on, back in February, I think the head of HR, or maybe the vice president of HR for diversity or something, which is separate from IDAA, interviewed me, and then I submitted a written statement.
And what was he or she like? I mean, they're not drawn from faculty around the university then, they're specifically dedicated to this cause. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, so there were 3 people, 1 from HR, 2 from IDAA. There's not much to investigate. So most of it was variations on what did you mean by this tweet and tell us more about the context surrounding your decision to tweet. I mean, it's kind of farcical. It's like a Monty Python sketch or something.
So let's fast forward to the next phase. So the Dean of Georgetown Law Centre, William M. Trina, he then issues a statement, which I can read out some of. He says, his tweets could be reasonably understood, and were in fact understood by many, to disparage any black woman the president might nominate. As I wrote at the time, Mr. Shapiro's tweets are antithetical to the work that we do at Georgetown Law to build inclusion, belonging, and respect for diversity. They have been harmful to many in the Georgetown Law community and beyond. There's quite a lot in that statement, I would say. What was your reaction to it?
My reaction to that statement that you read out from last Thursday, which was after I met with him when he told me that I was being reinstated on the technicality that, I wasn't an employee at the time, it was disturbing. It didn't sit well with me. So, I took to the pages of the Wall Street Journal to celebrate my technical victory. But there was, as I said at the outset, there was no indication that the free speech policy was being enforced or vindicated. And to the contrary, there'd be more implicit bias and discrimination training for all senior staff, not just me. I was being asked to meet with any students who were concerned. Other things like that. It was not a ringing endorsement. Despite his telling me that he wants me to succeed, he'll have my back. It was not a ringing endorsement. And so, in the ensuing days, I got the report from the IDAA office, which dropped in my inbox, several hours later that afternoon. And it took me a little bit to digest it with the help of counsel and my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us. And came to the conclusion around Saturday morning that this was not going to be tenable, that they were setting me up for a fall, that anytime I did my job by commenting on Supreme Court opinions, teaching a class on sensitive issues, and anyone felt or claimed offense or discomfort that would be it. That would trigger the hostile educational environment, and that would be it. Constitutional lawyers call that a heckler's veto on speech, and so I could neither walk on eggshells trying to avoid inadvertent offense, nor could I wait for that second shoe to drop and get, again, suspended and fired and disciplined and what have you. So I decided to go out on my own terms, noisily, with that 4-page letter, which I worked hard on over the weekend, detailing exactly where Georgetown's policies and their application failed.
And it should be said, you got another job. You have announced today you're now going to work for the Manhattan Institute. So to those people who think cancelees complaining is a bit of a joke and they always seem to do well, they will enjoy the fact that you've now got a nice new position in the Manhattan Institute. Tell us about that, and what would you say to them?
One thing I've learned, there are many lessons. I'm, of course, still processing this whole experience, this lived experience, as it were. One of the lessons is that they can't really cancel you if you refuse to be canceled. And I took the mindset, regardless of the parlor game over, should I have apologized? Should I have not? The standard advice now is never apologize. But for reasons that we don't need to get into, I still think that that limited apology that I issued, I think, still served me well. But eventually, I kept talking, I kept writing, I kept doing speeches, one of which was completely shut down and protested in San Francisco March 1st, which made me the subject of another news cycle. But I didn't back down, and I did not withdraw, and I did not go meekly. I did not issue further apologies or sign statements pledging to uphold the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion mantra or anything like that.
You have ended up fine, but arguably the institution is the poorer for this experience, because they thought you were the best person for this position in Georgetown Law. You're no longer there, you've resigned, and clearly there will be a ripple effect for anyone who comes from I guess you would call yourself conservative or centre-right, libertarian background. Applying to these kind of institutions will now think twice, because I guess their future is a lot less certain. So surely the effect will be to entrench the politics of these places and make them even more pure. And as for people who don't sign up to some of those politics, I don't know where they go.
Yeah, no, what I'm hoping to do is levy enough pressure on Georgetown and other institutions that, some administrators will think twice in the background. And they don't want fewer applicants, fewer students. Forget the woke mob. Most students are not activists of one kind or another, especially at a law school. They just want to get their diploma, get their credential, get a good job. And they just, follow the path of least resistance, don't want to get anything controversial. And it's those kinds of students that at the margins, I think, will have fewer applicants of. And that could hurt Georgetown. But that's the point, to pressure them to show that these policies, these illiberal trends that they're facilitating have consequences. And so that is my whole point of being on this weird media tour that I've been on these last 2 days, to shine the light for people who either aren't paying attention or think that there are isolated incidents on the rot in academia. And by the way, just to close the loop on myself, I'm fine in terms of I get a good job, I get media interviewing me or whatever, but my reputation is very different now than it was 5 months ago. And if you Google me a year from now, there's always going to be this stuff about the tweet and the scandal and is he racist and all of this sort of thing. So in a certain sense, I'm making out well, but it's certainly significantly changed my reputation and career arc, which who knows whether in the end that will all have been worth it. But again, the last 5 months were tremendously challenging and taxing on me and my family.
If we just put that statement from William Trina back on the screen, there's two components in it that I thought we could look at. The first is in the first half. He says, his tweets could be reasonably understood and were in fact understood by many to disparage any black woman the president might nominate. Clearly, as you've explained, you didn't intend that effect. You didn't intend to disparage anybody. You were saying that as you've explained, any candidate other than the best candidate would be lesser. But the implication of his wording here is that the fact that they were understood in that way means that they should be interpreted in that way. So in fact, the readers of any kind of public statement have a certain amount of control over how that statement should be interpreted. It feels like there's a kind of philosophical river that we'd cross to get there, where if that's, and in a way that's what I was asking about in the beginning, whether with your retraction, do you think we should allow that? Do you think we should concede the idea that those people reading or interpreting statements, if they are offended by it, that means that the statement was offensive?
Absolutely not. And that's what I meant by a heckler's veto. As I put in my resignation letter, I think it's actually unreasonable and in extreme bad faith to read it in a way that has a bigoted point. I think further that a lot of people spread the tweet. I wasn't the one spreading the tweet. People were screen capping it and dispersing it further to generate outrage. I'm not sure how many people actually were genuinely offended or what have you. It's kind of a gamesmanship to create an attack, to use this tool that I had given them with inartful phrasing to promote their agenda. But yeah, it's not a good thing. It's not a good. I don't think I was conceding that it was. I never conceded that it was a reasonable way of reading it or what have you.
So the other aspect of his statement here, he says, as I wrote at the time, Mr. Shapiro's tweets are antithetical to the work that we do. They have been harmful to many in the Georgetown law community and beyond. You hear this a lot as well. They have been harmful to many. I'm thinking here, who have they been harmful to, and what does that harm look like? And how can the dean of a law school make that statement unchallenged? It's imaginary harm, isn't it?
It's offense. It's your feelings are hurt. That's basically what it is. And the report I got from the Diversicrats backs that up and basically says anytime someone's feelings are hurt, that subjects you to discipline. That's why I wrote that the dean and the university bureaucracy have implicitly repealed their very well stated and well taken speech and expression policy, because effectively it's you have the freedom to speak unless someone's offended by that speech, which is no freedom at all. And I should say, the speech policy is very well taken, but it's proven to be a parchment or a pixel barrier, because what's being enforced is this rigid orthodoxy where you can't even tolerate inadvertent offense. Why? Because of the underlying perspective comes from a non-progressive orientation. And I further detail in my resignation letter that on top of the problems with the reading of the tweet, the standards that are being applied in terms of harassment and free speech, they're not even being applied or enforced evenly depending on where the speaker is coming from. And I detail several much more inflammatory, so-called harmful tweets from other law professors and main campus professors that were not investigated, were not punished, and shouldn't have been. But it's free speech for thee and not for me.
Let's end where we started, which is actually on the substance of the issue that you were tweeting about. I mean, you can see behind you, you've written a book about the politics of the Supreme Court. This is your area of expertise. That's why they hired you, and that's why you were tweeting about it. So what is the case there for why this is a bad idea? Because, my progressive friends in the US would say there is a very large pool of very skilled and talented African-American female jurists. Therefore, what's the problem? Let's redress a historical, absence, and let's fix it. And that's the case they make. And I'm sure the candidate they have chosen is extremely talented and good person. I'm sure she'll do a great job. What's the problem with it?
She's definitely qualified. All of the shortlisters were qualified to be on the Supreme Court. The problem is announcing at the beginning your criteria by race and sex, by immutable characteristics. If Joe Biden had simply gone about his selection process and ended up with Judge Jackson, now Justice Designate Jackson, and said, this is the best person, she's wonderful in all these ways, no problem. There's politics has always played a role in the selection of justices, judges, other high officials in different ways over our history. And so if he wants to provide that representational pick as part of a political calculus or what have you, we can have a parlor game debate about who the best candidate might be. But if he had done it that way, then I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you.
So actually, his mistake was saying the quiet part out loud, in a sense.
If he hadn't said that out loud, there would be no asterisk, at least for people in good faith. But yeah, I mean, it's just a sordid business. As Chief Justice John Roberts put it in a case about 15 years ago about school busing by race. He said it's a sordid business, this divvying us up by race. And it really is. I think as there's less actual racism in the country with each passing year, there's more inflammation of racial tensions by actions like this from public officials and cultural influencers.
Could you conclude for us by saying how serious you think the situation is? Because a lot of critics of a show like this or articles you have written will say this is making a lot of noise about something that isn't very widespread, isn't a real problem, and the net effect is better, and therefore it's all propaganda for the right in some way. Do you think it is a serious problem about justice and about the whole underpinnings of the state, or how serious do you think it is?
Well, for academia, I mean, there's a rot. There's a rot. It's this DEI ideology has undermined intellectual diversity, equal opportunity, tolerance of dissenting voices, the basic educational mission of seeking truth and engaging with ideas in a civil manner, going back to the earliest universities. So there's, in academia, it's a tough situation. The Georgetown Law faculty, about 150 people. There are 3.5 non-progressives, something like that. And there are schools where the ratio is even worse. So that's academia. In our broader society, we've seen a polarization. We've seen a trend where there's a decline in social trust, and there's a feeling that your political opponents aren't merely wrong, but evil. There's a decline in grace, that any screw-up is evidence of that evil, rather than just, they're human and fallible. But I think in the broader culture, there is starting, maybe, I don't know if the pendulum is swinging back, but at least there's green shoots. So Netflix said, if you're offended by some of our programming, maybe this isn't the place for you. State Farm, some corporations are kind of changing their tune. In large part, or at least in some part, after Ron DeSantis in Florida punished Disney for stances that it took in responding to one of his policies. So we'll see what happens. I am not optimistic about academia. I am cautiously optimistic about broader society.
Ilya Shapiro, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to Ilya Shapiro, a lecturer in constitutional law and an expert on the Supreme Court, who was going to be at Georgetown but is no longer, thanks to a single tweet about President Joe Biden's selection of his Supreme Court justice on the basis of race and gender. Some people will watch that interview and think, so what? He's fine. What's the big deal? But institutions like top universities are educating the next generation, and they hold huge sway in how our societies are governed. So if there is a rot, as he described it, it should worry us all. And by the way, if you are watching this and are a member of the mysterious Georgetown Office of Diversity, Equity and Affirmative Action and want to defend your organization, get in touch. We would love to have you on as part of UnHerd's Diversity of Opinion initiative. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd News.